Each autumn, just as the first leaves started to fall, the townspeople looked forward to the grand opening of the corn maze. Nestled on the outskirts of town, it was a sprawling labyrinth surrounded by towering cornstalks. Generations of families had navigated its twists and turns, jumping at hidden scares and laughing at friends who got lost among the rows. But this year, something was different. On opening night, crowds lined up eagerly, expecting the same chills and fun as always. As they entered the maze, the air felt strangely heavy, the rows of corn taller and thicker than in years past. A hush fell over the crowd as they walked deeper inside, the joyful chatter quieting, replaced by an unsettling stillness. Halfway through the maze, a group of teenagers paused, hearing faint whispers on the breeze. They laughed nervously, dismissing it as a trick of the wind. But the whispers grew louder, forming words they couldn't quite make out. Shadows flickered in the corners of their vision, darting between the rows, quick and soundless. One of them, Ellie, turned to her friend Nate, only to find him gone. At first, the others assumed he'd run ahead as a prank, but as minutes passed, Ellie began to panic. They searched, their footsteps crunching on the dry corn husks, calling his name, but their voices seemed swallowed by the maze. Just as they were about to turn back, Nate stumbled out from between the stalks, his face pale and his eyes distant, as if he'd forgotten where he was. "Are you okay?" Ellie asked, grabbing his arm. Nate nodded, though his expression remained blank. "I'm fine," he said in a flat voice. "We should leave." They left the maze, but Nate wasn't the same. He was quieter, his usual humor drained. He began to isolate himself, barely speaking to his friends, spending long hours in the dark. Other groups reported similar experiences, friends and family members who disappeared briefly in the maze only to return, distant and cold, changed in ways that were hard to describe. Over the next few days, a strange tension grew in town. Those who had vanished in the maze started gathering together in odd places, standing still in groups, whispering to each other in low voices that grew louder as more joined. One night, Ellie spotted Nate and others huddled under a street lamp, staring into the darkness. Their eyes seemed hollow, distant, but they all turned to look at her in eerie unison, sending a chill down her spine. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Ellie returned to the maze alone one night. As she stepped into the rows, the corn seemed to breathe around her, rustling as though alive. She followed the whispers, her heart pounding, until she found herself in a strange clearing at the maze's center. In the middle stood a scarecrow, its head a burlap sack with a wide, grinning mouth and empty eyes that seemed to watch her. The whispers grew louder, pressing against her mind, telling her to stay, to join them. Terrified, she tried to turn and run, but her feet felt heavy, as if roots were creeping up to hold her in place. In the moonlight, she saw shadows shifting within the corn, faces of those who'd gone missing, their eyes void of life, staring, reaching for her. With a burst of will, Ellie tore herself free and fled back through the maze, feeling unseen hands clawing at her as she ran. She didn't stop until she was out of the maze, panting and shaking, the haunted whispers echoing in her mind. But it was too late. She could feel it, a darkness settling deep inside her, as though the maze had left a mark on her soul. That night, she found herself drawn to the gathering beneath the street lamp, standing among those who had returned. She joined their murmured chant, her voice blending into the haunting whispers as the darkness within her grew. The next morning, townspeople avoided her gaze as she wandered, distant and hollow, now one of the many who carried the maze's curse back with them, a living shadow of the horror that lay within the corn. And each autumn, as the maze reopened, the darkness only spread further, waiting patiently for the next visitors to lose themselves among the whispering stalks. It started on the first day of October. Just as the leaves turned amber and crimson, a scarecrow appeared at the edge of the Jacobson family's cornfield. The figure was crudely constructed, with a weathered flannel shirt, torn jeans, and a burlap sack for a head. Its straw-filled arms stretched out stiffly, empty eye sockets staring at the farmhouse from across the field. At first they thought it was a prank, perhaps one of the neighbor kids getting into the Halloween spirit early. But by the following morning, another scarecrow appeared, just a few feet from the first, its clothes dirtier, its posture slouched. This time, Mrs. Jacobson noticed something odd about its jacket. It looked familiar. It was the exact same coat that she'd seen in the missing person posters of a young man from town who disappeared just last week. By the third morning, a third scarecrow had joined the others, its posture twisted and slack, wearing a dress that Mrs. Jacobson swore she'd seen before, worn by a young woman who had vanished in early September. Now, the unease in their home grew heavier. The family tried to ignore the scarecrows, hoping they were just the work of a cruel prankster. But each morning, a new figure appeared, inching closer to the house, each wearing the clothes of a missing person from town. On the fifth day, Mr. Jacobson had had enough. Determined to put an end to the macabre display, he grabbed an axe and marched out to the field, his wife and children watching from the porch. He took a deep breath, gripped the axe tightly, and swung it into the chest of the closest scarecrow. But as the blade hit the stuffed figure, a thick, dark liquid spurted from the wound. It wasn't straw inside, it was flesh. The scarecrow bled, thick red dripping from its chest, pooling in the dirt at his feet. Mr. Jacobson staggered back, horrified, his axe slipping from his grip. He yelled for his wife, his voice shaky as he pointed to the dark liquid on the ground. They watched in horror as the scarecrow seemed to shift, its burlap head lolling to one side, almost as if it were alive, its lifeless eyes rolling back to stare at them with a vacant hunger. The family fled back inside, locking the doors, trying to rationalize what they'd just seen. They huddled together that night, hoping the scarecrows would be gone by morning. But when dawn came, they ventured outside to find 5 new figures, all standing closer to the house. One was dressed in a familiar green sweater. Mrs. Jacobson clutched her husband's arm, recognizing it as the same sweater worn by their own neighbor, Mrs. Klein, who hadn't been seen in a week. In desperation, they tried to set the scarecrows on fire. Mr. Jacobson doused them in gasoline and struck a match. The flames caught, curling up the scarecrows' bodies, but as the fire spread, a low, moaning sound filled the air. The scarecrows twisted in the flames, writhing as if in agony, their mouths stretching open, and from each of them, a dark, pulsing heart could be seen glowing deep within their chests, beating in sync with an otherworldly rhythm. The family stared, horrified as the flames died, leaving the figures charred but still standing, the hearts within them still beating faintly. By the time the 12th scarecrow appeared, they were lined up in a single row, leading from the cornfield directly to the Jacobsons' front porch. The scarecrow's eyes were fixed on the house, vacant yet knowing, as though waiting, watching. When Mr. Jacobson tried to drive away with his family, the car wouldn't start, and every attempt to call for help was met with static on the line. The air around the house grew dense, heavy, filled with a rotten, earthy smell. On the last night of October, the Jacobsons huddled inside, too terrified to sleep. They heard a shuffling sound outside, growing louder, scraping closer. Finally, the sound stopped, and they peeked out the window. The scarecrows had moved to surround the house, their hollow eyes staring in through every window. The clock struck midnight, and a thick fog crept through the field, coiling around the house. One by one, the scarecrows began to move, staggering forward, their straw arms stretching out, grasping. Mr. Jacobson grabbed a knife, but the scarecrows pressed against the windows, cracking the glass, squeezing through the broken shards with unnatural flexibility. As they entered, the family backed away, but there was no escape. The last thing Mrs. Jacobson saw before darkness consumed them was the nearest scarecrow reaching out for her, its burlap head torn away to reveal a rotting, grinning face underneath, the face of the first missing person from town. His eyes, hollow yet somehow aware, bore into her as he reached for her, his bloody hands grabbing, pulling her into the unyielding darkness. The next morning, the farmhouse stood silent, the field empty save for a single line of scarecrows leading from the field to the porch. Each scarecrow wore clothes belonging to the missing Jacobson family, and each one had a heartbeat, a slow, relentless rhythm that pulsed in the early morning fog. The Henderson family had always loved the annual Harvest Festival. It was a beloved tradition in their town, nestled among rolling hills and fertile farmland. This year the air was crisp, and the autumn leaves painted the ground in shades of red, orange, and yellow. The festival stalls were brimming with fresh produce, cider, pies, and the year's prized apples, glossy, deep red, and perfect. The Hendersons, eager for the experience, grabbed a bushel of apples, their youngest daughter Lila biting into one as they strolled through the festival grounds. But as she bit down, her face contorted in shock. "Ouch!" she cried, pulling the apple away to reveal something lodged in its flesh. Lila's face went pale as she held up a rotten human tooth, half embedded in the fruit's pale interior. The vendor was quick to apologize, explaining it was likely a prank, an accident. His wide smile, however, didn't quite reach his eyes. Despite feeling unsettled, the family decided to brush it off, laughing nervously and moving along to the next stall. But as the day wore on, strange finds began popping up in their food. Little things at first. A bit of frayed cloth in a caramel apple, a chipped fingernail in the pumpkin bread, a small button in the cider. It all seemed strange, but the family rationalized it. Harvest festivals could be hectic. Perhaps these were just bits of random debris from hurried preparations. After all, the festival was crowded, and it was easy to miss these things in the rush. By late afternoon, however, the items grew more disturbing. Lila found what looked like a thin, splintered fragment of bone buried in a bag of popcorn. Her mother, Emily, peeled back the wrapper of a candied apple only to find a small, crumpled piece of cloth wedged into the chocolate coating. On closer inspection, she realized the cloth was torn from a plaid shirt, with tiny dark stains dotted across it. A chill passed over her, the festive cheer now feeling ominous and foreign. As the sun began to set, the Hendersons decided to leave, each feeling a growing sense of dread. But as they tried to leave the festival grounds, they noticed something strange. No matter which direction they walked, they found themselves looping back into the heart of the festival. "Maybe we just got turned around," Mr. Henderson suggested, trying to keep everyone calm. But when they retraced their steps, they only ended up back at the apple vendor's stall. The vendor grinned at them knowingly, his eyes dark and sunken as though he hadn't slept in days. "Leaving already?" he asked, his voice low. He reached under his stall and pulled out an apple that was even redder, shinier than the rest, its surface so polished it seemed to glow. "On the house. This one's special." Emily reached out for it instinctively, entranced by the apple's surreal beauty. But as soon as she touched it, a sickly sweet odor wafted up from the fruit. She recoiled, and in the fading daylight she noticed a faint trickle of a dark, rust-colored liquid seeping from the stem, as if the apple itself was bleeding. The vendor's grin grew wider. "You should know," he said softly. "Our produce isn't just grown. It's harvested." The family backed away, horrified. They tried once again to escape, but every path seemed to lead them back to the festival grounds. Panicking, they pushed through the stalls, the cheerful decorations now casting ominous shadows in the dimming light. The food that once seemed so enticing was now a grotesque reminder of what they had found earlier. The cakes, pies, and apples seemed to pulse and glisten in the evening shadows, as if alive with a dark secret. Desperate, they dashed towards the festival's orchard, hoping to find a way out. But as they stepped into the orchard, they froze. Dozens of apple trees lined the path, each branch hanging heavy with ripe fruit. But among the apples, they could see other things, small personal items snagged on branches, a child's doll, a torn scarf, and even a pair of cracked glasses. Beneath each tree, the earth was freshly disturbed, as if something or someone had recently been buried. Suddenly the ground seemed to shift beneath their feet, and whispers filled the air. They could hear faint voices, begging, pleading, and crying for help. They stumbled back, and as they turned, they saw the vendor again, standing at the edge of the orchard, a twisted smile on his face. "You're part of the harvest now," he said in a voice barely above a whisper. "Every year the town must give back to the land, and this year, well, we needed a little more." With dawning horror, the Hendersons realized what the festival truly celebrated. They tried to run, but their feet felt heavy, as if the very ground was holding them in place. The trees seemed to loom closer, their branches reaching out like twisted fingers. As the last of the daylight faded, the family disappeared into the orchard. By morning, all that remained were 4 freshly dug mounds at the base of the trees, and in the vendor's stall, a new basket of perfect blood-red apples. The town went about its day as usual, and the harvest festival continued on, the townspeople never mentioning the Hendersons again.